We paid off over $380,000 of student loan debt in just over 6 years. How did we do it? Well, in this video, we're talking about how we paid off over $385,258 of student loans in 75 months with real numbers and statistics while we were making pharmacy residency and medical residency and fellowship salaries over 6 of those years. Later on, we'll talk about how we increased our income to pay off this extreme student loan debt as fast as possible while living in a high cost of living area of Los Angeles, California. Make sure you stay to the end to find out those steps. Hi everyone, I'm Jessica, and I love talking about financial freedom after experiencing burnout early on in my pharmacist career. On this channel, we talk about passive income and how we use it along with simplifying to combat burnout and stress in our lives. So you might be wondering, how did we go about accomplishing this extreme student loan debt payoff as fast as possible while making resident and fellowship salaries? The first step was facing the facts. Back in 2013 and 2014, when each of us graduated, we were hit with large student loan bills. And those bills can be really shocking if you're not aware of them. I personally was aware of my student loans because my parents had helped track everything and we were really intentional about how I took up my student loans. But my husband was really surprised when he got his bill in the mail. Now, my husband thought that he had taken out $180,000 in student loans over his 8 years of bachelor degree and doctorate degree, but it wasn't the case. I'll show you the exact amount later on in this video and how we went about paying it off. Before we get into all the details about all the numbers and the statistics and how we went about paying off our student loans, I want to share our story a little bit so that you know why we got into this predicament, how we pulled ourselves out of this landfill, and how we became debt-free and financially free in just 75 months. So many of you who have watched my channel probably know a little bit about my background and my burnout story. You can also watch those videos, but I spent 7 years training. I spent 3 years on my bachelor degree and 4 years on my doctor of pharmacy degree, all from USC. And my husband spent 4 years at a UC school and then 4 years with his doctorate degree at USC. I then pursued a 2-year residency afterwards, and he pursued 5 years of residency and 1 year of fellowship. So he had 6 years of postgraduate training. I had 2 years of postgraduate training. So overall, I spent 9 years training to become a board certified critical care pharmacist, and he spent 14 years training into his specialty and becoming board certified as well. Now, we had both taken out student loans for our undergraduate degrees, our bachelor degrees, and our graduate doctorate degrees. And there was a different breakdown for each of those degrees. Now, I do want to pause and say that as high income earners now, after all of that training, we are very privileged. I was also very privileged to come from a family who talked very openly about money and planned really intentionally for our graduate and postgraduate opportunities to be able to budget and afford this type of schooling. And you can see later on in the numbers how that broke down to be really privileged in this. So I do not want to underestimate that privilege, and I want to now talk about how we went about taking the next steps in our journey after facing the facts. And when we were facing the facts, I think it's also important to note that we are now high income earners after all of our training, but during our training years, 2 years for me and 6 years for my husband, those years are at a lot lower salary than attending or a board certified pharmacist when we're making full salaries after all of our training. And during residency and fellowship, residency was 2 years for me, residency and fellowship was 6 years for my husband. The salaries were about 20 to 30% of what we now make as high income earners as healthcare professionals. And those salaries are much different, right? Typically they start around 40,000 and then increase over time to about 70,000, maybe 80,000, depending on what city you're completing your training in. So those numbers are obviously 5-figure salaries. They're not 6-figure or multi-6-figure salaries that we are used to when we do complete our training as healthcare professionals. So I want to note that because our journey involved a lot of payoff during our residency and fellowship years, and not when we're making multi-six figures as high income earners. And that's where our journey might be a little bit different than others. So over the 75 months, we paid off over $385,000 of student loan debt. 72 of those months, so 6 years out of those 6.25 years, we were actually making 5 figures as residents or fellow. And I wanted to just note that because we are not someone who won the lottery. We're not someone that has these 6-figure incomes while we're paying down so much debt. As part of facing the facts, it was also deciding how we're going to approach this debt. And approaching this debt can mean a lot of different payoff options. It can be really confusing to figure out how to pay off your student loans. And all of our student loans were through the government-backed programs. There were no private type of loans. So the best place to find ways to pay was on studentaid.gov. And this is where you can see all your options. They can change by the year and what's going on with those loan repayment systems. So back in 2013 and 2014, when we graduated, we had different options back then versus today. Based on those options, which I will go into how we made that decision and what our debt payoff would look different if we chose a couple different options later on in this video, we decided to pay off our student loans as fast as possible and to separate our finances during this so that we were not paying on each other's loans. So I paid on my loans and he paid on his loans, and we did not intertwine our finances. We did not have any joint accounts. I did not make payments on his accounts and he did not make payments on my accounts. And we wanted to keep it separate, and that was a personal decision that we made as a couple so that during that time frame, we were boyfriend, girlfriend during that whole process. Later on, we were engaged and now we are married. And it was important for us to keep it separate and feel accomplished that we each were able to tackle the loans and increase our incomes during those times. We also made the decision that we wanted to go debt-free before we were married, before we had kids, before we bought a house, right? Before we had major life transitions. And this was an intentional decision that we personally made. It was a personal choice that we made, and you may not have some of those choices in your own journey, but that was something that we decided was best for our relationship. Now, many of you might be thinking, why didn't you pursue a public loan service forgiveness program? Because you were in residency fellowship for so many years, particularly my husband, who was in it for 6 years. And yes, he would have had 6 years into that PSLF program because he spent 6 years in a public service type of format through his residency and fellowship programs, and he would have needed to spend another 4 years to get to that 10-year mark. Now, we opted not to go this route because we did not want to rely on anyone else, even the government, to put our financial well-being in their hands. And remember, this was a decision we made back in 2013, 2014 when we graduated. And back then, PSLF, there was little known about it. No one had actually gone fully through the program at that time. So we made it a calculated decision back then to pay it off as fast as possible, not rely on anyone, including the government. And that was a personal choice. And we'll go through the numbers about if that worked out in our favor or not in our favor later in this video. So when we're listing out and facing all of the facts, it was really important that we figured out where all of our loans were, who were they serviced by, and what were the actual numbers that we needed to pay all of these providers. So, getting out a chart and getting out all of those passwords and all those logins is going to be really helpful in this stage. So I'm going to show you on the screen exactly where all of our loans were from, what year they were from, and the amount that we owed. Now, we mostly tracked on a free Microsoft Excel file to keep all this information at bay. And then if you actually don't know where a lot of this information is and you haven't received mail and information about it, another way to check this would be your credit score. So if you went into a free credit report from one of the 3 major providers, it will actually list all of your loans on there as well. And when we check that, quarterly in our household, we actually see all of the old loans that are still on our accounts as paid in full. Let's face the facts together and show you the actual real numbers here. Now, when I said earlier in the video that my husband thought he had taken out $180,000 in student loans, what was his actual bill when we opened up all of the statements and all of his accounts? His total bill was $236,538. That is over $56,000 more than he thought he had taken out in student loans over his 8-year journey. For my bill, it was $50,005. So combined, we had a student loan bill of $286,543. And that was big, right? That much money can actually buy you a house, a home in certain areas of the country. Maybe not in Los Angeles area, but in certain areas of the country. So we had a lot of student loan debt that we graduated with, and we needed to find a way to pay it off. And over the next 75 months, we obviously paid it off, and we actually paid much more than the total bill, and we'll talk about why that is with all the interest included. So you can see from the chart that the student loans were broken up into medical school versus undergraduate. So for medical school, the bill was $217,778, and from bachelor degree undergraduate was $18,760. You can see that the majority of the loans were at 6.8% interest rates, one at 7.9%, and then less than $10,000 was at that low 2.3% interest rate. You can see on my loans, my total bill of $50,005, with $36,000 of that coming from my pharmacy, doctor of pharmacy program, and $14,500 coming from my undergraduate program, with majority at 6.8% and then a little bit at 5% interest rate. So that was facing the facts. So that's the first step, and that step can be really overwhelming. So please make sure that you set aside some time, some support systems to gather all the information that you need, find out where all of your loans are, whether they are government-backed public loans or if they are private loans. Find them all, get them all gathered up, get all your logins ready, and face them head on so that you can start planning out your goals of how to pay them off. So when we went into the goal setting stage, we used the Kakeibo method. I've talked about the Kakeibo method in detail in other videos, so please make sure to watch those videos as well. In general, the Kakeibo method is really simple, and we wanted to keep it as simple as possible, breaking down our expenses into 4 different areas of survival, optional, cultural, and extra expenses, and then figuring out after we went through expenses how we were going to then increase our income and pay off these loans as fast as possible. So we'll get to how we actually made extra payments on these loans and where that money came from as residents and fellows in healthcare. Now, we listed out our goals in each of those 4 areas of the Kakeibo method in survival, optional, cultural, and extra. And the first thing to tackle really was our goals in our survival category, because the majority of expenses are going to usually come from our housing, our transportation, and our food. And those are the 3 big areas to focus on when you're looking at expenses, because we can reduce our expenses as much as possible, especially in those 3 survival areas. And then it only comes to a certain point where then expenses are reduced to bare minimum or to how we want to live our life. And then we want to increase our income. So we tackled the 3 big in these different ways, and we're going to share them with you right now. I want to note that when we were tackling these survival categories, it's really important when you set up your goals to not fall into the inflation and the lifestyle trap. Because, even if we are residents and fellows, our incomes are increasing, and our incomes are increasing from the other sources of income we're going to talk about today, that we don't fall into some trap where we continue to spend more and more on those big 3 categories. So we made sure that we didn't fall into that lifestyle inflation trap on housing, transportation, and food. So you might be thinking, well, how am I going to tackle housing in a high cost of living like Los Angeles, California? And it is really a high cost of living. After growing up in the Midwest in Wisconsin, it is a very different environment to pay for housing out here. So to decrease that housing expense, we decided not to live on our own. It can be really costly if you're just 2 people living on your own in an apartment or in a house. So we decided to rent a room from our sister and brother-in-law who house hacked. They had been house hacking before we decided to rent a room for them. And luckily they, lived within 12 miles of Los Angeles and had a 4-bedroom home. So we rented a bedroom from them, and that expense was amazing because we could save so much money by not living by ourselves. Typically, if we were living by ourselves as 2 people in an apartment or a home, we would be spending about $2,500 to $3,500 on housing and utilities. Whereas renting a room from a family member meant we were spending $1,500 or less on that housing and utility expense. So that was our big saving for our housing costs. So next step was our transportation costs. So to keep our transportation costs low, we both kept our cars. Mine is a 2000 Camry and his was a 2007 Honda Civic. we had no car payments and we had no collision insurance on those cars because they were so old, and we were able to continue driving them. I actually still own my 2000 Camry now in 2021, and it is 21 years old and running strong with less than 200,000 miles on it. Okay, so for food, in topping off our 3 big categories for survival, we decided to start cooking more at home. We already had learned how to cook from both of our families, and we just needed to simplify the process. We simplified it down into 15 simple meals that we could cook over and over again. And then I would take those leftovers for lunch the next day, and he would sometimes take those leftovers, or he was provided food at the hospital for free as well. We both ate breakfast at home, and then we limited when we went out to restaurants or fast food. And when we did go out for restaurants or fast food, we decided to decrease that expense by not having beverages when we went out. So we would have the free water. We would only have the main meal, and we would like to have meals outside of the home that we couldn't cook. So it was more special for us to go out to eat. Okay, so after applying the Kakeibo method and tackling our 3 big spending categories in our survival and optional modes of housing, transportation, and food, it was time to tackle how can we start increasing our income. Now, this is an important step because there's only so far you can go to decrease your expenses before you start feeling really deprived in life, and it's time to start increasing your income. Now, I want to note that we didn't increase our income right away. I waited about 1 year before I started increasing income streams, and my husband waited about 3 years before he started to increase his income streams. And this is because it's important to get a hold of where your full-time job is, what all the training is involved, and make sure that you're not overloading your plate at the time by just simply, going out and increasing your income and becoming so stressed out and burned out that it's not worth it. So we waited a little bit, and then we increased our income. I outlined 7 different ways to increase our income in a separate video, so you can watch how I grew mine in more passive mode, entrepreneurial mode, and my husband grew his more with moonlighting and taking on additional roles in the medicine world to increase his income, and how we both did it where we were able to give back to communities that needed personnel more in rural areas that were outside Los Angeles, maybe 2 hours, 3 hours outside of Los Angeles, that needed more healthcare personnel in our per diem and part-time roles to increase our income. Now, this additional income from over 7 streams of income, in the passive entrepreneurial world for me, and in more of the moonlighting healthcare world for my husband on evenings and weekends, accounted for over $150,000 of gross income. We were able to use that additional $150,000 plus towards student loan payments on each of our respective loans over time. Here is a graph of our student loan payments, and you can see at the beginning there was very small changes made, right? A lot of times in the beginning of your student loan payments, you are paying towards the interest versus towards the principal of the loan. So it does take a little bit of time to see a large decrease in that total balance, but making those payments and scheduling them every single month to have automatic deductions, and then scheduling in additional payments from our side income, our additional streams of income, was important. Now, you might be wondering if we took the snowball versus the avalanche approach, and we decided to make the decision to take the snowball method. And that's because you can see from the chart that we had a lot of different service providers, a lot of different accounts to log into, and a lot of different separate loans over time. So it was important that we built up momentum at the beginning to see that we were making progress towards paying this off as fast as possible. So we paid off the smaller loans as fast as possible and paid the minimums on all of the other loans, of course. And then we built up momentum until we only had 1 loan left. And for my husband, that was a really large loan, a 6-figure loan that was left for him to work on at the end. And for me, it was a little bit different. But overall, we decided to take the snowball approach that worked best for our relationship and our goals. Finally, we made extra payments on the principal of the loan outside our automatic monthly payments towards that loan. And this was where our additional income streams came in, where we were able to make those additional payments towards our loan. And if you are not familiar with this method, make sure that you call your loan service provider to make sure they apply this correctly to your loan. We know that a lot of times this was mistakenly done on our service loan providers, and there was lots of phone calls to make sure it was done correctly. quickly so that the money went where it needed to go. Now, in total, we paid $385,258 to our student loans over 75 months. Yes, it was so exciting to pay this off. This was a really big bill. And you can see that we paid way more than we actually took out loans for, right? Because of all the interest rates. And we went with a standard repayment plan over 10 years and then paid it off faster in just over 6 years. So I know many of you are asking, would it have been better to go with the PSLF option or a different option? So I wanted to break those down for you in terms of how much we would have paid in other options. Well, if we were on the standard 10-year repayment plan, we would have paid $580,451 towards our loans. That is a whopping $195,193 difference in how much we paid. That basically is another house that we could have paid towards those loans. By paying it off almost 4 years faster, we saved so much in the interest payments towards the loans. But for PSLF, we would have been left with a forgiveness amount of between $295,000 to $395,000, depending on what PSLF model we decided to go with. And that forgiveness amount may have been taxed as income when it was forgiven, if it was forgiven at all, because the forgiveness rates are very, very low at this time of the recording. So we opted not to go with that method. Yes, we would have paid less towards the loan over 10 years. We also would have needed to work within a public sector for 4 more years after residency or fellowship. And that would have forgone some income potentially in that 4-year period of working in a public sector versus a private sector for 4 more years, and relying on the government to forgive this loan and not tax us the forgiveness amount. So in our opinion, we went with the better option of paying it down as fast as possible, not relying on anyone else or the different circumstances that could come about with PSLF type of programs. So that was a breakdown of how we paid off over $385,000 of student loan debt. And we can't wait to hear your stories about your student loan debt repayments. Make sure that you are facing the fact, setting up your goals, using the Kakeibo method towards your journey. You can get your resources on how to apply the Kakeibo method to your debt-free journey as well. I'll link below in this video, and watch our videos on how we increase your income with passive income, new streams of income, and how we invested towards our financial freedom, retire early, the FIRE movement in our own journey. Thank you for watching, my friends. Until next time, cultivate joy.